Good morning and welcome to Inside Tennessee. I'm your moderator, John North. John Becker is away this morning. Our guest is Herbert Slatery, who has just completed an 8-year term as the state's top lawyer. He was the Attorney General. We'll be talking to him for most of this half hour. But before we dive into that, I want to introduce our guests. We have our regular panelist, Don Bosch, who's a Democrat and an attorney here in Knoxville. And joining him is Eddie Smith, a Republican former lawmaker. Welcome to both of you guys. Good to see you.
Good morning. Nice to see everybody here.
Good to be seen, as they say. General, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it, truly. Let me just, we're going to dive into topics because we have a lot we want to talk about, but let me just briefly sketch out your biography. You were for several decades an attorney here in Knoxville, which is your hometown. And then about the time that Governor Haslam went over to Nashville, you joined the, if you will, the Knoxville Mafia, assisting him as counsel. And then I think in 2014, the state Supreme Court appointed you in this unique position that only Tennessee does it this way. The Supreme Court here in Tennessee appointed you to be the Attorney General. It has been a fascinating ride, no doubt, and you have covered a lot of territory, which we'll talk about, all kinds of stuff, including news that has just been happening this summer. But if I'm remembering correctly and doing a little bit of research, General, you were in the function of this office in the history of the state of Tennessee, the first Republican appointee. Is that correct?
That's correct. The first one since Reconstruction. And the means that the appointment was set out in the 1870 Constitution. So yes, I'm the first Republican.
General, did that, from your point of view, does that mean anything? I mean, I've heard you speak about being a lawyer first. I'm just curious, did that mean anything to you in particular, being the first Republican AG?
It's not something that I lead with, to be honest with you. I think that's part of the history of the AG office in Tennessee, is that it's basically a law office. I mean, the Attorney General is not a politician for the most part, and the Supreme Court just appoints a top lawyer, which I think it's a great system. So, if people ask, I tell them, and I think people would put me with the Republican AGs across the country, but it's not something that I wave as a flag or anything like that.
Yes, sir, I understand. All right, well, let's talk about the news that broke this summer, one of the most high-profile cases you've worked on, I would assume, in your function as office, and that is following the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court's decision in regards to Roe v. Wade and abortion, sort of your thoughts on that and your enforcement of Tennessee laws. Don Bosch, let's start with you. You have a question for the AG?
Sure. Herb, first, thank you for your service. While we may politically disagree on occasion, I know how difficult the job is of State Attorney General, and you served it well and with honor. So I wanted to thank you first. And now I can argue there's no conflict because there's nothing you can do to help or hurt me back in the private sector. So, but that said, talking about the Tennessee trigger ban, as you can imagine, and I think we've seen the legislation that is currently on Tennessee's books that not only prohibit abortion, but criminalize it for any physician who then must prove, after they've been charged through an affirmative defense, that the life of the mother, and that does not mean mental health, it does not mean for a child conceived out of rape or incest, or a fetus conceived out of rape or incest, but that statute is really problematic, and there is quite the uproar. First question I'd have about that is, were you consulted and did you weigh in much, either at the request of the legislature or the governor, about this statute and sort of its practical effects in Tennessee?
That particular statute was passed pretty quickly. I don't recall us playing a really significant role in that. We played a much more decisive and substantial role in a 48-hour waiting. Well, not in the prior act, and that had the time limits. It had the anti-discrimination provisions and things, and that was the act that we actually worked on really pretty hard in our office. But the trigger law was not one that we weighed in on heavily. The legislature and their legislative staff, who are really good lawyers, I think they handled most of that.
Well, did the legislative staff handle it, or the lobbyists that really were anti-Roe v. Wade? Did they seem to handle more of the drafting of this legislation? Because even now, some very conservative legislators, and I think Eddie has a closer relationship with those folks than I would, but they're even suggesting, hey, we've got to go back. And while they may hold to their guns generally about Roe v. Wade, that some real tweaks have to be done. Do you agree, now that you're unburdened with the office that you previously served in, that we really should think about putting some exceptions and amendments into this current legislation?
Well, I think the magic of the Dobbs case is that it sent that issue back to the states where it belonged in the first place, in my opinion. And what you're seeing now is that now the states have to think through the issues, and they're looking at all the ramifications and the penalty provisions and exceptions and things like that. And the states across the country are dealing with it, and that's the way it ought to be. And the reason for that, Don, is that's the first time the people get a chance to actually have a voice on that policy issue. Until now, they've had no voice. It was Roe versus Wade, and that's it in the case of decision. So,
let's do this. We can pick up with that, but we need to take a break right now.
I think that's exactly where it should be.
We can rejoin the conversation because we also want to hear from Eddie Smith. But we need to take a break right now, and you're watching Inside Tennessee.